Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. So if you and or your team are still taking phone calls and receiving vendor supporting documentation via email, you need to authenticate that you are talking or communicating with your vendor. Please visit deborah.richardson.com/authentication, where you will find a workshop on how to build an authentication reference. This is the answer to the question, are you communicating with your vendor or with a fraudster? Learn more today at deborah.richardson/authentication. So are you or do you have a new team member in vendor maintenance and want some training recommendations? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 106, 5 recommendations to train your new vendor maintenance team member. So I'm going to talk about this subject under the context of having a new team member or vendor maintenance team member that needs to be trained. But definitely if you're a new team member and you resonate with any of these recommendations, bring that up to your new supervisor, your new management, new leadership to see if they have some of these options available, because it's only going to help you do a better job. So let's go ahead and get started. So you have a new accounts payable or AP team member that will be assigned to the glorious, at least I think so, task of maintaining your vendor master file. So this includes adding new vendors, making changes to existing vendors, maybe issuing 1099s for vendors that need to be reported in box 1. And if you don't know, that's the new 1099 NEC for tax year 2020, or maybe issuing 1042s for foreign vendors, and of course cleaning the vendor master file. And I do realize that different companies will have different functions to train on that are not necessarily related to AP that every new team member still needs to know. But I'm going to treat that separately. So here I will focus only on the vendor maintenance functions. And then I also want to point out that I specified AP because purchasing in those instances, I think the last benchmark that I saw on IOFM was that purchasing was responsible for the vendor master file in 26% of the time. The rest of the time it's AP. And I do want to make sure that I make that distinction, because purchasing, they may have different functions that the new vendor maintenance team member may need to know, such as reviewing and classifying a strategic vendor, for example. And here I'm just going to focus on those AP tasks. Although sometimes AP may be looking at that strategic vendor, but for the most part, I'll focus on those things that relate to setting up a vendor, changing a vendor, and then also fraud. So the first thing I do want to also point out is that vendor Maintenance is the new front line against cyber criminals. I'm going to repeat that. Vendor maintenance is the new front line against cyber criminals. At least I think so. Now more than ever, training is essential for new vendor maintenance team members with an increase in social engineering scams, including business email compromise. It isn't enough anymore only to train on the need for compliance, such as with the IRS or OFAC fines. Awareness and the reason for authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices need to be made clear. Then, once you explain the why, the most important part is explaining the how. So they have resources and references to carry out their duties. Now, if you want to see a video on vendor maintenance is the new front line against cyber criminals, I do have a link to the related blog post, and in the blog post you'll be able to click on the link to the video. So the 5 training recommendations. The first one is the vendor maintenance policy. And this policy can be part of your AP policy or it can be separate, but you do need to have one. It tells your internal team members how to do business with the AP vendor team. How to set up a vendor, how to change an existing vendor, what documents are required, what the turnaround time is. And you can also generate a welcome letter to new vendors or instructions for existing vendors from that document. It gives your new team member a background and an overview for the details that they will be responsible for. Okay, the second recommendation, of course, is cybersecurity awareness. Now, this can be company training that includes how to scan emails for fraud, how to recognize common frauds, and what specifically has been done at your company to prevent payment fraud. Now, again, this can include adding authentication techniques to ensure they are communicating with the real vendor. And if you want more information on the authentication workshops to build a reference, you can check the link in the show notes. And it can also include internal controls such as multiple approvals for emails that request payments and other best practices. So make sure that that team member is aware of whatever your company has done to mitigate the risk of fraud especially with vendor setup. And I know that there are some companies out there, third parties that provide that. So if it's not company training, then maybe it's third party, or maybe your company training is only done once a year, and so you've got some third-party tool that you use to train team members. So make sure that they have one or both of those. All right, the third recommendation is, of course, desktop procedures. So now that your new vendor maintenance team member has an overview of the process and fraud awareness, it's time to get into the details. So have a desktop procedure for each function and each ERP. And the best practice is to have one person create it and then another one tested to avoid those scenarios or those where you have details where the person that created it thinks that the details, everybody should know those, and they really don't. So make sure you have one person create and then one or more persons or team members walk through the process or the desktop procedure that they just created to make sure that they can understand it as well. And you also want to make sure you include screenshots and instruction for both external and internal processes. So for example, in my vendor add change desktop procedure templates that's included in the toolkit, And I'll have a link to the toolkit in the blog post, which will be linked in the show notes. But anyway, in my toolkit that has vendor forms, communication templates for the vendors, and template desktop procedures, I have instructions for external things like 10check and sam.gov if you're a government, and then if you are a hospital, then you need to check the OIG site, the Office of Inspector General. And so I have instructions on how to check those exclusion lists, and so you should too. So whatever they need to check, you need to make sure you include it. And I do recommend that you have at least the 7 process docs, maybe more depending on what your functions are, but at least these 7. And that is the new vendor add, the existing vendor change, and then for foreign vendors you need a new vendor add and existing vendor change as well, unless you can fold it into the other desktop procedure and not make it so long. I usually split those two up because foreign vendors have additional validations, and the process doc or the desktop procedure, you just don't want it to be that long. So I usually split those up. And then you want to have one for the vendor master file, vendor data review process, which is the vendor master file cleanup, which I recommend you do at least annually, but if you can, quarterly, and at the if you can and have the staff for it, especially now in this age of fraud, do it monthly. That's my real recommendation. And then, of course, if the vendor master team, vendor maintenance team is responsible for 1099s and 1042s, then you want to have the 1099, how to generate and then distribute those forms. And then the same thing, separate desktop procedure for 1042s, how to generate and distribute that. All right, number 4. So this is where we get into one-on-one training. And so you need an experienced team member. So now that your new vendor maintenance team member has reviewed all the applicable desktop procedures, have them sit with a trained team member and watch that trained team member with each type of request. Then have the trained team member switch and have the trained team member watch them perform each type of request as well. And you want to make sure that questions are encouraged. Sometimes this can be an area of short answers if the trainee asks one too many questions. So make sure that you choose a trainer that is patient, especially if you have multiple accounting system ERPs and a vendor self-registration portal, and maybe you've got different tools for different things that they're going to have to access. It is confusing to someone that's coming into that role, and you may already know that, but it can be confusing. So make sure that you have a trainer that is patient and that can answer their questions without being too short, because you don't want to discourage questions. Now, the 5th one is an audit. So now that your team member is trained, implement a weekly audit of 100% of their work. Once they consistently pass the audit with better than, 90%, release them on their own for the regular monthly vendor process audit. And if you're not already performing an audit or getting audited at the vendor process level, I do recommend you start to make sure that your team or you are following the processes that were put into place to prevent fraud, reduce compliance penalties and fines, and to measure performance. Now, Some of you who have approvals in your vendor master file or in your vendor add and change process where a vendor has to be approved may think you don't need an audit, but those that are approving those vendor requests, supervisors, managers, or higher, if they start to get, it can be time consuming at that level. So my recommendation is that before it gets to that level, make sure you have some type of an audit. And at that level, someone else can do the audit. Maybe the trainer does the audit 100%, and then let them go on their own after they have a better than 90% average of correct processing over the week. Now, that was the fifth one, and I almost had a sixth one, but I didn't list AP certifications, and I didn't list them because the initial goal is to be able to function within your company, and the new team member needed to be trained on your processes. However, having a training plan for continued development, I know we all know about this. It's important so that your new employee can enhance their skill set. I mean, that can be critical, especially now. You want to be that critical thinker that keeps up with AP trends, especially AP vendor maintenance trends. I do have and will have a link that's in the blog post, and the blog post link is in the show notes, that has several certifications or AP certifications available through IFOL or ACAP, and you can read more about that organization or AP organization in the link. But it does include a vendor master file fraud prevention specialist. CFPS is the acronym. It's a certification that I created that is based on my authentication, validation, management 3-step process for vendor setup and maintenance. And so check that out. And again, you want to have continuous learning, you want to have a training plan, and AP certifications can definitely be a part of that plan. All right, so good luck. I know training can be challenging, especially now if AP is working from home, but hopefully these recommendations help. And if I missed anything, I would love to hear about it, and I'm sure others listening to the podcast would love to hear about it as well. So make sure you comment on the platform that you're using to listen, or just email me at deborah@deborah.richardson.com. I'll have my email address in the show notes, and let me know what I missed, and maybe I'll cover it on a future podcast episode. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 106th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.